When a dusty will hidden behind a portrait reveals that lowly housemaid Eleanor Reed is the true heir to Thornfield Manor, her life transforms overnight. The family who once commanded her now scrambles for her favor, but only the groundskeeper who always saw her worth might be worthy of her heart. What begins as a shocking discovery just might end in justice long overdue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the grand hall of Thornfield Manor struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the empty corridors. Eleanor Reed, 28 and exhausted from another 16-hour workday, climbed the servants' staircase with aching feet. Her thin cotton uniform was stained with polish and dust, her once nimble fingers raw from scrubbing floors that the Blackwood family would barely glance at. "Eleanor!" Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, called sharply from below. "Mr. Blackwood wants the library cleaned again before morning. Says there's still dust on the upper shelves." Eleanor paused, one hand gripping the worn banister. "I cleaned the library this morning, Mrs. Winters." "Every shelf. Just as always." "Well, clean it again," the older woman snapped. "The master is entertaining important guests tomorrow. Everything must be perfect." Swallowing her exhaustion, Eleanor nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Winters." She watched the housekeeper's retreating figure, then turned back toward the main house, her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of another sleepless night. Thornfield Manor stood as a monument to old money and older secrets. The Blackwood family had owned the estate for generations, their fortune built on shipping and, some whispered, less savory enterprises. Eleanor had worked there for 10 years, ever since her parents died in a fire that consumed their modest home when she was 18. The library was cavernous, lined with leather-bound books that hadn't been read in decades. Portraits of stern-faced Blackwood stared down at her as she dragged the heavy ladder across the polished floor. The current master, Richard Blackwood, was the worst of them all, cold, demanding, and quick to find fault with the staff's work. As Eleanor climbed the ladder to reach the highest shelves, her attention was drawn to the portrait of Cornelius Blackwood, the family patriarch who had died 30 years ago. Unlike the others, his eyes seemed to follow her with an expression almost like recognition. She'd always felt a strange connection to this painting, though she couldn't explain why. "We're both watching them, aren't we?" she whispered to the portrait. "You from your gilded frame, me from the shadows." Speaking to paintings, Mrs. Winters would say she was losing her mind from fatigue. As she dusted around the frame, Eleanor noticed something odd. The portrait hung slightly askew, and behind it, the wallpaper appeared disturbed. Curiosity overcame caution. Balancing carefully on the ladder, she lifted the heavy portrait away from the wall. There, in a small cavity cut into the plaster, was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Eleanor's heart raced as she pulled it free. Written across the front in faded ink was a single line: "To be opened upon my death. Cornelius Blackwood." Eleanor's hands trembled. This was clearly important, something the family should know about. The sensible thing would be to take it directly to Mr. Blackwood, but something, intuition or perhaps self-preservation, made her slip the envelope into her pocket instead. In her tiny attic room, with its sloped ceiling and narrow bed, Eleanor examined her discovery by candlelight. The seal was unbroken, the paper thick and expensive. Whatever this was, it had remained hidden for 3 decades. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself. Opening mail meant for the Blackwoods could cost her job, the only security she had in the world. Yet her fingers were already breaking the seal, unfolding the crisp paper inside. What she read made her blood run cold, then hot with disbelief. "I, Cornelius Blackwood, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament, superseding all previous wills. To my son Richard, I leave nothing but the knowledge of his greatest betrayal. To my daughter Charlotte, I leave a stipend of £500 annually to be managed by my solicitor. And to my true heir, my granddaughter Eleanor Reed, daughter of my beloved and wrongfully disowned daughter Margaret, I leave Thornfield Manor and all associated properties, businesses, and accounts. Eleanor read the paragraph 3 times, her mind refusing to accept the words. Her mother had been Cornelius Blackwood's daughter. That would make Richard Blackwood her uncle, not her employer. Thornfield Manor, the house she had cleaned and polished and maintained for a decade, was rightfully hers? Impossible, she whispered. But even as she denied it, memories surfaced. Her mother's refined speech, her knowledge of literature and music, her reluctance to speak of her past. The occasional strange look from the older staff members who had served during Cornelius's time. At the bottom of the document were the signatures of 2 witnesses and the name of a solicitor's firm in London, Harrington and Wells. The paper trembled in her hands as the implications crashed over her. If this will was legitimate, everything would change. But would anyone believe her? A housemaid claiming to be the rightful heir to one of the county's largest fortunes? She would be dismissed as a lunatic, or worse, accused of forgery. Eleanor barely slept, the hidden will tucked beneath her thin mattress like a burning coal. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would take her next half-day off to visit the solicitor's office in London. If the will was genuine, they would have records. 3 days later, dressed in her only decent outfit, a navy blue dress she saved for church, Eleanor stood before the imposing offices of Harrington and Wells, trying to gather her courage. The clerk at the front desk eyed her suspiciously. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "I need to speak with someone about a will," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It concerns Cornelius Blackwood of Thornfield Manor." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "And you are?" "Eleanor Reed." She hesitated, then added, "His granddaughter." The young man's skepticism was evident, but he disappeared into a back office. Minutes later, an elderly gentleman emerged, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Miss Reed? I'm Edward Harrington. Please, come through." In his cluttered office, Eleanor placed the will on his desk. "I found this hidden behind a portrait at Thornfield Manor, where I work as a housemaid." Mr. Harrington examined the document carefully, his expression changing from professional interest to shock. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "We've been searching for this will for 30 years. Eleanor's heart skipped. "Then it's real?" "Very much so. I witnessed it myself." He looked up at her, studying her face. "Yes, I see it now. You have Margaret's eyes. Your mother was a remarkable woman." "You knew her?" "Indeed. She was Cornelius's favorite child. But she fell in love with a gardener at the estate." "Your father, I presume." "Richard was furious at the match. He threatened to cut her off entirely if she married beneath her station. When she defied him, he told Cornelius she had run away with a married man, disgracing the family." "But that's not true," Eleanor protested. "My parents were devoted to each other." Cornelius discovered the truth too late. By then, Margaret had been disowned, and Richard had positioned himself as the sole heir. When Cornelius tried to make amends and rewrite his will to include Margaret and her child, Richard ensured the new will vanished. He tapped the document. Until now. "What does this mean?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer would shatter her world. "It means, Miss Reed, that you are the rightful owner of Thornfield Manor and the Blackwood fortune. Richard has been living on borrowed time and stolen property for 30 years. Mr. Harrington's eyes gleamed. Justice, it seems, has finally found its way home. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the grand entry hall of Thornfield Manor, no longer in her maid's uniform, but dressed in a simple yet elegant green dress, purchased with an advance from her inheritance. Mr. Harrington stood beside her, along with 2 police officers and a court official. The household staff gathered on one side, their expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. On the other stood Richard Blackwood, his wife Victoria, and their son James, all pale with shock and fury. "This is preposterous!" Richard shouted, his face mottled red. "Some scheme cooked up by a grasping servant girl." "The will has been authenticated by the court, Mr. Blackwood," Mr. Harrington replied calmly. "The signatures match, the paper is correct for the period, and the witnesses have confirmed its legitimacy. Most damning, your own attorney admitted under oath that you instructed him to suppress the original will 30 years ago. Richard's face drained of color. Miss Reed is Cornelius Blackwood's legitimate granddaughter and heir. Thornfield Manor and all assets belonging to the estate are now legally hers. The court official stepped forward, handing Eleanor a thick folder of documents. The transfer is complete, Miss Reed. Or should I say, Miss Blackwood, if you prefer to take the family name. Eleanor felt dizzy with the unreality of it all. Just weeks ago, she had been on her hands and knees scrubbing these very floors. Now she owned them. "You can't do this," Victoria Blackwood hissed. "We are the Blackwoods. This is our home." "Not anymore," Mr. Harrington said. "By court order, you have 1 week to vacate the premises and relinquish all assets belonging to the estate." The news spread through the household like wildfire. Staff members who had once ordered Eleanor about now called her Madam, with downcast eyes. Mrs. Winters, who had worked Eleanor to exhaustion for years, offered her resignation on the spot. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Winters," Eleanor said quietly. "I know what it means to need employment." Only one person seemed genuinely pleased by the turn of events. Thomas Hayes, the groundskeeper, approached her in the garden the next morning, his smile as warm as ever. "Always knew there was something special about you," he said, presenting her with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Never seemed right, someone with your grace cleaning up after those people." Thomas had been the only one who treated Eleanor with kindness during her years of service. He had shared his lunch with her on cold days, helped her carry heavy buckets, and once fashioned a salve for her chapped hands from herbs in the garden. At 32, with kind eyes and strong hands weathered by outdoor work, he was considered handsome by the maids, though Eleanor had never allowed herself to think of him that way. A housemaid couldn't afford romantic notions about anyone, let alone a fellow servant. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, accepting the flowers. "It's good to know I have at least one friend here." "More than a friend if you ever wanted," he said, then looked away, embarrassed by his boldness. "Sorry, Miss Madam, that was inappropriate." "Eleanor?" she corrected him. "I'm still Eleanor." Their eyes met and something flickered between them, a possibility perhaps now that the barriers of station had been removed. The week passed in a blur of lawyers, accountants, and discoveries. Eleanor learned that her grandfather's fortune was even larger than she had imagined, with investments and properties extending far beyond Thornfield. She also discovered journals kept by Cornelius that spoke of his regret at losing Margaret and his determination to make amends. "He loved my mother," she told Thomas as they walked through the rose garden Cornelius had planted decades ago. "And he would have loved me if he'd had the chance to know me." "Anyone would," Thomas replied simply. On the day the Blackwoods were to leave, Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching as servants carried out their luggage. Richard refused to look at her, his back rigid with fury. Victoria wept dramatically, clutching her jewelry case. Only James, Richard's son, approached Eleanor. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "About your mother, about what my father did. I want you to know that." Eleanor studied him. This cousin she never knew she had. "I believe you," she said finally. "This must be difficult." James gave a bitter laugh. "Less difficult than scrubbing floors for 10 years in your own house." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough for all the years stolen from her. But it was something." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you, James." As the Blackwood carriage pulled away, Eleanor felt not triumph, but a strange emptiness. The house that had been her prison was now her home, yet she felt like a visitor in its grand rooms. That evening she found herself back in the library staring up at the portrait of Cornelius Blackwood. "I found your will, grandfather," she said softly, "but I'm not sure I know how to be what you wanted me to be." "You don't have to be anything but yourself," came Thomas's voice from the doorway. He approached slowly, respectful of her space. "Begging your pardon for interrupting." "You're never an interruption, Thomas." Eleanor smiled at him, grateful for his steady presence amid the chaos of her new life. "I feel lost in this house. I know every inch of it, have polished every banister and washed every window, yet I don't know how to live in it." "Then make it yours," Thomas suggested. "Not as a Blackwood Manor, but as Eleanor Reed's home. The simplicity of his suggestion struck her. This was her chance not just to claim a fortune, but to remake the house into something new. Something good. "The East Wing has 20 rooms that have been closed up for years," she said slowly. "They could be converted into a school for local children, or perhaps housing for families in need." Thomas's eyes lit up. "The old stables could become workshops, teaching trades to young people without prospects. And the gardens could be open to the public," Eleanor continued, warming to the idea. "Not just as a showpiece, but as a place for people to grow food and medicinal herbs." They talked for hours, reimagining Thornfield not as a monument to wealth and privilege, but as a center for community and opportunity, all the things Eleanor had been denied. When Thomas finally rose to leave, Eleanor impulsively caught his hand. "Stay," she said. "Not as the groundskeeper, but as my partner in this. I can't transform Thornfield alone." Thomas looked down at their joined hands. "People will talk. The new mistress and the gardener's boy. They'll say you're repeating your mother's story." "Let them talk," Eleanor replied. "My mother chose love over fortune, and from what I've learned of her, she never regretted it. Besides," she added with a smile, "I happen to have both a fortune and the freedom to love whom I choose. It seems only right to honor her courage with my own." Thomas's expression softened, and he brought her hand to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and sincere. "I've cared for you since the first day you arrived, Eleanor Reed. Watching you endure their cruelty broke my heart. Seeing you claim your rightful place healed it." "Then help me use this place for good," she said. "Help me make Thornfield Manor worthy of its new beginning." In the weeks that followed, Thornfield transformed. Eleanor moved out of the master suite, too grand, too haunted by Richard's presence, and into a sunny room overlooking the gardens. She hired back staff who had been dismissed under Richard's tenure, paying fair wages and instituting reasonable hours. The town's reaction to her change in fortune was predictably mixed. Some welcomed the return of Cornelius's true heir, while others repeated vicious rumors about her parentage and worthiness. Through it all, Thomas remained her staunchest ally, defending her against whispers and standing proudly at her side at public events. When the first children arrived for classes in the newly established Thornfield School, Eleanor stood on the front steps to welcome them, remembering her own thwarted dreams of education. "Welcome to Thornfield," she told them, her voice clear and confident. "Everything here is yours to learn from." A small girl with tangled hair and wary eyes, so like Eleanor had once been, approached hesitantly. "Are you really the maid who became a lady?" Eleanor knelt to meet the child's eyes. "I was never just a maid, and I'm not quite a lady," she said gently. "I'm simply someone who found her place in the world, and I promise you will find yours too." As the children filed past into the house that had once been forbidden to their kind, Eleanor felt her grandfather's will had given her something far more valuable than wealth. It had given her the power to right old wrongs and create the home she had always deserved, one built on compassion rather than cruelty, opportunity rather than oppression. And with Thomas by her side, his hand steady in hers, Eleanor knew that the greatest inheritance wasn't the manor or the money, but the chance to love freely and build a life unconstrained by the very barriers her mother had defied so many years ago. As autumn crept across the Thornfield grounds, Eleanor found herself settling into a new rhythm. Each morning she walked the gardens with Thomas, planning expansions to the vegetable plots and discussing which fruit trees to plant come spring. The morning light softened his features, turning his brown eyes almost gold, and Eleanor often found herself watching him instead of the landscape he described so passionately. "We could plant apple trees along the south wall," he was saying, gesturing toward an unused stretch of land. "In a few years we'd have enough fruit for the school children and the village." "Always thinking ahead," Eleanor said with a smile. "I'm still getting used to planning beyond tomorrow." Thomas took her hand, a gesture that no longer felt bold but necessary. "When you spend your life tending gardens, you learn to see what isn't there yet." His eyes held hers. "The most beautiful things take time to grow." They were interrupted by Mrs. Jenkins, formerly a scullery maid, now elevated to housekeeper after Mrs. Winters had finally retired. "Begging your pardon, madam, but Mr. Harrington has arrived from London. He says it's urgent." Eleanor's heart sank. The solicitor rarely brought good news these days. Richard Blackwood had been filing lawsuit after lawsuit, challenging her claim to the estate, despite the authenticated will. "Tell him I'll be right in," she said, reluctantly releasing Thomas's hand. In the morning room, Mr. Harrington waited with a grave expression that confirmed her fears. "Miss Reed, I'm afraid I have troubling news. Richard Blackwood has filed a new claim, alleging that your mother was not, in fact, Margaret Blackwood, but an impostor who assumed her identity." Eleanor sank into a chair. "That's absurd. You knew my mother." "Indeed, but it was many years ago. Blackwood has produced a woman claiming to be the real Margaret Blackwood, supposedly living abroad all these years." "A paid actress, no doubt," Eleanor said bitterly. "Almost certainly," Mr. Harrington agreed. "But it complicates matters. The court has ordered an investigation, which means your access to the estate accounts will be restricted until this is resolved." "He means to starve me out," Eleanor realized. "Without access to funds, I can't maintain the house, the school, or pay the staff." "Precisely his strategy, I fear. Blackwood knows the legal battle could take months, even years. He hopes you'll be forced to abandon Thornfield and accept a settlement." Eleanor clenched her hands in her lap. "I will not be cheated out of my birthright a second time." "I admire your resolve, Miss Reed, but practical matters remain. How will you maintain Thornfield without access to the accounts?" It was a question that haunted Eleanor long after Mr. Harrington departed. The school had just opened. 20 children from the village now received daily education, where once there had been none. The workshops Thomas had established were teaching carpentry and metalwork to young men with few prospects. How could she abandon them now? That evening, she gathered the senior staff in the library, Thomas at her side. She explained the situation frankly, not hiding the precariousness of their position. "I understand if any of you wish to seek positions elsewhere," she concluded. "I cannot guarantee when or if this matter will be resolved in my favor." Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. "Begging your pardon, madam, but we've all served the Blackwoods for years, most of us for poor wages and worse treatment. Now, for the first time, we work for someone who treats us as people. We're not going anywhere." Cook, a formidable woman who had miraculously transformed from surly to cheerful under Eleanor's management, nodded firmly. "We'll tighten our belts. I can manage with less in the kitchen." One by one, the staff affirmed their loyalty, until only Thomas remained silent, his expression unreadable. "Thomas?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. If he left, she wasn't sure she could bear it. "I sold my cottage in the village last month," he said finally. "I've been saving to buy a small nursery where I could grow plants and trees." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. "It's not much, but it's yours for as long as you need it." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she looked at the man offering her his life savings without hesitation. "I can't take that," she whispered. "You're not taking it," he said simply. "I'm investing it in something I believe in someone I believe in." His words moved her more deeply than any declaration of love might have done. Here was trust, faith, and devotion demonstrated not in pretty phrases but in sacrifice. In the days that followed, the entire household operated with wartime efficiency. Cook performed miracles with simple ingredients. The groundskeepers sold excess produce from the kitchen gardens at market. The older children from the school began helping with household tasks in exchange for their lessons. Eleanor herself sold her new dresses and the few pieces of jewelry she had purchased, keeping only what was necessary. She moved out of her comfortable bedroom and into a small room off the kitchen to save on heating coal. Richard Blackwood, upon hearing of these measures, arrived unannounced one rainy afternoon. Eleanor received him in the library, where Abe to make my Eleanor his heir. Knowing Richard's nature, he has hidden a copy in the house, behind his portrait, where Richard would never think to look. But he also entrusted me with something more precious, a locket containing a lock of his hair and mine, along with a miniature portrait of us both, and a signed statement affirming I am his daughter and Eleanor his granddaughter. I keep this treasure close, but fear Richard's retribution should he discover our reconciliation. If anything should happen to Edward and me, please find Eleanor and ensure she receives her rightful inheritance. Eleanor looked up, tears streaming down her face. Do you have it? The locket? Jonathan nodded. After I learned of the fire, I tried to find you, but you had vanished. I've kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment. From another pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. This belongs to you now. Inside was a gold locket, tarnished with age. When Eleanor opened it, she found exactly what her mother had described. A small portrait showing a younger Cornelius with a beautiful young woman who shared Eleanor's eyes, and 2 locks of hair secured behind glass on the opposite side. Beneath them, on a tiny scroll of paper, was written in Cornelius's hand, I, Cornelius Blackwood, affirm that Margaret Blackwood is my legitimate daughter, and her child Eleanor, my true granddaughter and heir. DNA testing wasn't available then, Jonathan explained, but hair samples from both of you, along with this sworn statement and portrait showing your resemblance, should satisfy any court, especially when compared to current samples from you. This is extraordinary, Eleanor whispered. Why would you go to such lengths for a family not your own? Jonathan smiled sadly. After your parents died, Margaret's letters meant a great deal to me. When my wife passed away some years later, I made a promise that if I ever had the chance to fulfill Margaret's wish, I would. Some debts can never be repaid, but they can be honored. The evidence Jonathan provided proved irrefutable. When presented to the court, Richard's case collapsed. The impostor he had hired as the real Margaret Blackwood disappeared, and his lawyers withdrew their objections. Within weeks, Eleanor's full rights to the estate were restored, along with access to all accounts. Richard Blackwood, facing potential charges of fraud, fled to the continent, his reputation in tatters. On a crisp October morning, Eleanor walked with Jonathan through the gardens, showing him the improvements they had made to the estate. The school now has 43 pupils, she told him proudly. We've hired 3 teachers, and Thomas's workshops are teaching valuable trades to young people who would otherwise have few opportunities. Margaret would be proud, Jonathan said. Not just of what you've done with your inheritance, but of who you've become, despite all you've endured. I wish I remembered her better, Eleanor admitted. I was so young when they died. She lives in you, Jonathan replied. In your resilience, your compassion, your refusal to surrender what matters most. Those aren't traits you learn, they're passed down, like the color of your eyes or the shape of your hands. They paused by a newly planted apple sapling, one of dozens Thomas had set in neat rows along the south wall. You and Thomas, Jonathan said carefully. You remind me of Margaret and Edward, the same quiet certainty between you. Eleanor blushed. He's been my strength through all of this. I don't think I could have endured it without him. Have you told him so? Not in those exact words. Jonathan smiled. Some things shouldn't remain unspoken, my dear. Take it from someone who knows the value of time. That evening, Eleanor sought Thomas in his workshop, where he was teaching a young boy how to sand wood to a smooth finish. She waited until the lesson ended, and they were alone among the tools and wood shavings. I never properly thanked you, she said, for offering your savings when I needed it most. Thomas shook his head. You didn't take it in the end. But you offered, without hesitation, everything you had. She stepped closer, breathing in his familiar scent of earth and pine. Why did you do that, Thomas? His eyes met hers steadily. You know why. I'd like to hear you say it. Thomas set down his tools and took her hands in his, calloused palms against her now softer ones, to make my Eleanor his heir. Knowing Richard's nature, he has hidden a copy in the house, behind his portrait, where Richard would never think to look. But he also entrusted me with something more precious, a locket containing a lock of his hair and mine, along with a miniature portrait of us both, and a signed statement affirming I am his daughter and Eleanor his granddaughter. I keep this treasure close, but fear Richard's retribution should he discover our reconciliation. If anything should happen to Edward and me, please find Eleanor and ensure she receives her rightful inheritance. Eleanor looked up, tears streaming down her face. Do you have it? The locket? Jonathan nodded. After I learned of the fire, I tried to find you, but you had vanished. I've kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment." From another pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. "This belongs to you now." Inside was a gold locket, tarnished with age. When Eleanor opened it, she found exactly what her mother had described. A small portrait showing a younger Cornelius with a beautiful young woman who shared Eleanor's eyes, and 2 locks of hair secured behind glass on the opposite side. Beneath them, on a tiny scroll of paper, was written in Cornelius's hand, "I, Cornelius Blackwood, affirm that Margaret Blackwood is my legitimate daughter, and her child Eleanor, my true granddaughter and heir." DNA testing wasn't available then, Jonathan explained. But hair samples from both of you, along with this sworn statement and portrait showing your resemblance, should satisfy any court, especially when compared to current samples from you. "This is extraordinary," Eleanor whispered. "Why would you go to such lengths for a family not your own?" Jonathan smiled sadly. "After your parents died, Margaret's letters meant a great deal to me. When my wife passed away some years later, I made a promise that if I ever had the chance to fulfill Margaret's wish, I would. Some debts can never be repaid, but they can be honored." The evidence Jonathan provided proved irrefutable. When presented to the court, Richard's case collapsed. The impostor he had hired as the real Margaret Blackwood disappeared, and his lawyers withdrew their objections. Within weeks, Eleanor's full rights to the estate were restored, along with access to all accounts. Richard Blackwood, facing potential charges of fraud, fled to the continent, his reputation in tatters. On a crisp October morning, Eleanor walked with Jonathan through the gardens, showing him the improvements they had made to the estate. "The school now has 43 pupils," she told him proudly. "We've hired 3 teachers, and Thomas's workshops are teaching valuable trades to young people who would otherwise have few opportunities." "Margaret would be proud," Jonathan said. "Not just of what you've done with your inheritance, but of who you've become, despite all you've endured." "I wish I remembered her better," Eleanor admitted. "I was so young when they died." "She lives in you," Jonathan replied. "In your resilience, your compassion, your refusal to surrender what matters most. Those aren't traits you learn, they're passed down, like the color of your eyes or the shape of your hands." They paused by a newly planted apple sapling, one of dozens Thomas had set in neat rows along the south wall. "You and Thomas," Jonathan said carefully. "You remind me of Margaret and Edward, the same quiet certainty between you." Eleanor blushed. "He's been my strength through all of this. I don't think I could have endured it without him." "Have you told him so?" "Not in those exact words." Jonathan smiled. "Some things shouldn't remain unspoken, my dear. Take it from someone who knows the value of time." That evening, Eleanor sought Thomas in his workshop, where he was teaching a young boy how to sand wood to a smooth finish. She waited until the lesson ended, and they were alone among the tools and wood shavings. "I never properly thanked you," she said, "for offering your savings when I needed it most." Thomas shook his head. "You didn't take it in the end. But you offered, without hesitation, everything you had." She stepped closer, breathing in his familiar scent of earth and pine. "Why did you do that, Thomas?" His eyes met hers steadily. "You know why. I'd like to hear you say it." Thomas set down his tools and took her hands in his, calloused palms against her now softer ones. "Because I love you, Eleanor. Not as the mistress of Thornfield or as the heir to a fortune, but as the woman who stops to help kitchen maids with heavy buckets, the woman who knows every child in the school by name, the woman who still gets up at dawn because she can't break the habit of a lifetime of early rising." Eleanor felt tears threatening. "Even when I was just a housemaid?" "Especially then," Thomas said softly. "When you had nothing, your kindness showed most clearly. You were never just anything to me, Eleanor. You were always extraordinary." She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. "I love you too," she whispered, "not as my groundskeeper or my ally, but as the man who sees me completely and loves me anyway. The man who believes in growing things and second chances." His arms encircled her, strong and certain. In his embrace, Eleanor felt something she had rarely known. A sense of coming home, of belonging not to a place, but to a person who chose her freely and completely. When Jonathan returned to America a month later, Eleanor and Thomas accompanied him to the port. As the ship prepared to depart, Jonathan pressed something into Eleanor's hand. A small leather journal. "Your mother's diary," he explained. "I've kept it all these years, reading it when I missed her voice. Now it belongs with you." Eleanor embraced him, this man who had traveled across an ocean to fulfill a promise to a woman long gone. "You will visit again?" "Count on it," Jonathan promised. "And perhaps next time I'll be attending a wedding?" Eleanor glanced at Thomas, who colored slightly but didn't contradict the suggestion. They had spoken of marriage, of joining their lives officially, though in truth they were already inseparable. Thomas had moved from his small room above the stables to a comfortable suite adjacent to Eleanor's, close enough for conversation in the evenings yet still observing propriety, at least in the eyes of the household. As they watched Jonathan's ship disappear toward the horizon, Thomas took Eleanor's hand. "He's a good man," he observed. "To keep faith with your mother all these years." "Some connections transcend time and circumstance," Eleanor replied. "Like my parents finding each other across social divides. Like us." They walked back through the town, passing shops and cottages where people now greeted Eleanor with genuine warmth, rather than the wary deference of her early days as Thornfield's mistress. The transformation hadn't come easily. For months after her inheritance was confirmed, rumors and suspicion had dogged her steps. But slowly, as Thornfield School educated their children and its workshops provided employment, the community had come to accept, then appreciate, then finally embrace the former housemaid who now led them. "Miss Reed!" called a small voice. It was Emma, one of the youngest students at the school, running toward them with a paper clutched in her hand. "Look what I made!" "Miss Wilson says I have a talent for drawing." Eleanor knelt to examine the child's artwork, a colorful depiction of Thornfield with children playing in the gardens. "It's beautiful, Emma. Perhaps we should frame it for the school entrance?" The little girl beamed with pride, then looked up at Thomas. "Mr. Hayes, will you teach us about trees tomorrow like you promised?" "Of course," Thomas smiled. "Every good artist needs to know how to draw a proper oak tree." As Emma ran back to her waiting mother, Eleanor felt a surge of contentment. This was what the Blackwood fortune was meant for. Not hoarded behind manor walls, but flowing outward, creating opportunities, fostering talents, building a community where everyone could thrive. Later that night, Eleanor sat in her private sitting room, reading her mother's journal by lamplight. Thomas dozed in the armchair opposite, a book about fruit cultivation open on his lap. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. How natural it felt to share these quiet moments, how complete she felt in his presence. In her mother's journal, she found an entry dated shortly after her own birth. "Held Eleanor today and watched her sleeping. Such perfect tiny fingers. Such trust in her peaceful face. Though we have little in material wealth, I would not trade this life with Edward and our daughter for all the Blackwood fortune. Father was wrong. Love is not a luxury for the privileged few, but a necessity for a life well lived. I pray Eleanor will understand this someday, that she will know the value of a heart freely given is worth more than any inheritance." Eleanor closed the journal, her mother's words resonating across time. Looking at Thomas, his face relaxed in sleep, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly what her mother had wished for her. Not just the material inheritance that was her right, but the greater inheritance of love freely chosen and freely given. "Thomas," she said softly, waking him, "I think it's time we were married." He blinked sleepily, then smiled as her words registered. "Are you proposing to me, Eleanor Reed?" "I suppose I am." She moved to perch on the arm of his chair. "Is that terribly modern of me?" "Terribly." He pulled her down beside him, the chair barely accommodating them both. "But then you've never been one for convention, have you? The housemaid who became the mistress, the woman who rebuilt an estate, the heiress who loves a gardener." "The woman who knows what truly matters," Eleanor corrected, resting her head against his shoulder, "as my mother did before me." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting Thornfield's grounds with white. Inside, in a room warmed by firelight and shared dreams, Eleanor felt the circle of her life closing and opening simultaneously. The past honored, the present embraced, the future stretching before them like one of Thomas's gardens, waiting to bloom. The news of Eleanor and Thomas's engagement spread through Thornfield and the surrounding village with the swiftness of winter wind. Most received it with genuine pleasure. The staff, who had witnessed their devotion through the darkest days of uncertainty, celebrated with an impromptu feast prepared by cook. The children at the school presented them with handmade cards decorated with flowers and trees, reflecting Thomas's influence on their education. But beyond the protective boundaries of Thornfield, not all reactions were positive. The county's older families, who had reluctantly accepted Eleanor as Cornelius Blackwood's heir, found her choice of husband a step too far. A groundskeeper, Lady Pembroke sniffed during her weekly tea circle, where the county's most influential women gathered to exchange news and judgments. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. The girl was a housemaid after all. One cannot expect proper breeding to manifest itself without proper upbringing. Such sentiments, carried by servants and tradespeople, eventually reached Eleanor's ears. Mrs. Jenkins reported them with righteous indignation one morning as she arranged flowers in the morning room. "The nerve of them," the housekeeper fumed. "As if Mr. Hayes isn't worth 10 of their idle sons who do nothing but gamble and drink away their allowances." Eleanor smiled, touching a delicate rosebud Thomas had cut especially for her. "Their opinions matter very little to me, Mrs. Jenkins. Besides, they'll find something new to gossip about soon enough." Yet despite her brave words, the whispers did sting. Not for herself. Eleanor had developed a thick skin during her years in service, but for Thomas, who deserved respect for his character and accomplishments, not disdain for his occupation. The situation came to a head when the annual winter charity ball approached. Hosted by the Pembrokes for generations, it was the social event of the season, raising funds for the county hospital while serving as a showcase for the region's elite. In previous years, Eleanor would have been among the army of maids working behind the scenes. Now, as mistress of Thornfield, she had received a formal invitation. "You should attend," Thomas told her as they reviewed the correspondence over breakfast. "It's an important charity, and your presence would lend support to the hospital." Eleanor frowned at the heavy cream envelope. "They've invited me, not us. There's no mention of my fiancé." Thomas shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. "That's not unusual. These old families are set in their ways." "Their ways need changing," Eleanor said flatly, reaching for the bell to summon Mrs. Jenkins. "Please draft a response declining the invitation. We'll make a donation directly to the hospital instead." But Thomas caught her hand before she could ring. "Eleanor, you can't isolate yourself from county society because of me. Thornfield has always played a central role in local affairs. If you withdraw now, it will only fuel their prejudice." "I won't go where you aren't welcome," she insisted. Thomas's expression softened. "I've spent my life working outdoors because that's where I'm happiest. Fancy ballrooms and formal dinners hold no appeal for me. Go. Represent Thornfield, and come home to tell me all about it." Before Eleanor could argue further, they were interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, Dr. Elizabeth Foster, the new physician at the county hospital. A forthright woman in her 40s with streaks of gray in her dark hair, Dr. Foster had become a frequent visitor to Thornfield, overseeing the health of the school children and advising on the medicinal herb garden Thomas had established. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Jenkins, "but I've come with a proposition that couldn't wait." Eleanor welcomed the distraction. "What sort of proposition?" Dr. Foster gestured toward the window where the east wing of Thornfield was visible. "I understand several rooms in that wing remain unused since the school occupies only part of it." "That's true," Eleanor confirmed. "We've been considering how best to utilize the space." "The hospital is desperately overcrowded," Dr. Foster explained. "We've had to turn away patients, particularly those needing long-term convalescence. I was wondering if Thornfield might consider housing a small recovery ward for patients who need rest and fresh air more than intensive medical care." Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances, a silent communication that had become natural between them. "How many rooms would you need?" Thomas asked. 5 or 6 to start. Enough for perhaps a dozen patients, plus accommodation for a nurse or two." "And the cost?" Eleanor inquired. "The school already stretches our resources." Dr. Foster set down her teacup decisively. "The hospital would provide staff and equipment. As for the rest, I thought perhaps we might approach the Winter Charity Ball Committee. Their funds are meant for exactly this kind of expansion." Eleanor smiled. "An idea forming. The ball is in 3 weeks. Do you think we could prepare a proper proposal by then?" Dr. Foster's eyes gleamed. With your help, absolutely. The following week saw Thornfield buzzing with new energy. Eleanor, Thomas, and Dr. Foster worked late into the nights, drafting plans for what they began calling the Thornfield Recovery House. Thomas designed modifications to make the rooms accessible for patients with limited mobility. Eleanor calculated budgets and operating costs. Dr. Foster provided medical expertise and patient projections. This could transform healthcare in the county, Dr. Foster declared as they finalized their proposal, particularly for those who can't afford private care. 2 days before the ball, Eleanor visited the local dressmaker rather than ordering from London, as her predecessors might have done. Mrs. Collins, who had sewn Eleanor's maid uniforms years earlier, was overwhelmed by the commission for a ball gown. Nothing too elaborate, Eleanor instructed. Something dignified, but not ostentatious. They selected a deep blue silk, simple in cut but elegant in drape. As Mrs. Collins pinned the fabric, her hands trembled slightly. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Collins hesitated. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn, Miss Reed, but are you certain about attending the ball? Lady Pembroke has been quite vocal about her views regarding your engagement." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "All the more reason to attend, Mrs. Collins. Some battles must be fought face to face." On the night of the ball, Thomas helped Eleanor into the carriage, adjusting the wrap around her shoulders against the December chill. The blue gown complemented her eyes, and she wore her mother's locket at her throat, her only jewelry apart from her simple engagement ring. "You look beautiful," Thomas said, his admiration evident. "Remember, you're not just Eleanor Reed tonight. You're the mistress of Thornfield and a Blackwood by blood. Hold your head high." "I'd rather be Eleanor Hayes already," she replied with a small smile, using the name she would take after their spring wedding. "But I suppose Thornfield deserves one last formal appearance from a Blackwood." Thomas kissed her gently. "I'll be waiting up." Pembroke Hall blazed with light as carriages deposited guests at its doors. Eleanor took a deep breath before descending from her carriage. The leather portfolio containing their proposal clutched perhaps too tightly in her hands. The footman announcing arrivals faltered slightly at her name, but Eleanor pretended not to notice as she entered the grand ballroom. Conversations stuttered as heads turned toward her, then resumed with increased urgency. She caught fragments, "actually came," and "bold as brass," and "without her gardener," but kept her expression serene as she made her way toward Lady Pembroke, who stood receiving guests with frigid politeness. "Miss Reed," the older woman acknowledged with a barest nod. "How? Unexpected to see you here." "I wouldn't miss an opportunity to support the hospital," Eleanor replied smoothly, "especially given Thornfield's new interest in healthcare initiatives." Before Lady Pembroke could respond, Dr. Foster appeared at Eleanor's side, resplendent in a burgundy gown that contrasted with her usual practical attire. "Miss Reed, I'm so glad you've come. Several committee members are eager to hear about our proposal." Lady Pembroke's thin eyebrows rose. "Proposal?" "For the Thornfield Recovery House," Dr. Foster explained, with just enough enthusiasm to prevent Lady Pembroke from dismissing the idea outright. "A convalescent facility for patients needing extended recovery time. The plans are quite remarkable." Curiosity warred with disdain on Lady Pembroke's face. "Indeed? How? Charitable of you, Miss Reed." "Not charity," Eleanor corrected her gently. "Responsibility. The Blackwood fortune was built on the labor of people from this county. It seems only right that it should serve their needs now." Throughout the evening, Eleanor navigated the social minefield with a grace that surprised even herself. Years of observing from the margins had taught her more about these people than they realized. She knew their vanities and rivalries, their secret struggles and public facades. Knowledge that allowed her to approach each influential guest with exactly the right combination of deference and confidence to secure their interest in the Recovery House project. By midnight, when the committee gathered to review proposed recipients for the ball's proceeds, Eleanor had secured the support of key members. She presented the portfolio to Lord Pembroke, who chaired the committee, her voice steady as she outlined the benefits the Recovery House would bring to the community. 12 beds may seem modest," she concluded, "but for those 12 patients and their families, it will mean the difference between prolonged suffering and proper recovery. All we ask is the opportunity to serve our neighbors in their time of need." The committee retired to consider all proposals. Eleanor slipped onto a terrace for a moment of quiet, the December air sharp in her lungs. The stars above reminded her of nights at Thornfield, walking the gardens with Thomas, planning their future beneath the same vast sky. "Quite the performance," came a voice from the shadows. Richard Blackwood stepped into the light, immaculately dressed and clearly intoxicated. The servant girl playing the great lady. Entertaining, I must say. Eleanor stiffened. "I wasn't aware you had returned to England." Richard waved dismissively. "Temporarily. Legal matters. Nothing that need concern you." He moved closer, the smell of brandy heavy on his breath. "You know, you've caused me considerable inconvenience, niece." "The truth caused you inconvenience," Eleanor corrected him. "I merely discovered it." He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Truth? Do you think these people care about truth? They care about bloodlines and traditions, and keeping their world exactly as it has always been. You may have Cornelius's name and fortune, but you'll never truly belong here." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I have no desire to belong to a world built on the exploitation of others. I'm creating something better at Thornfield." Richard's amusement vanished. "With your gardener husband? Don't be naive, Eleanor. You've made yourself a laughingstock, the housemaid who found a will and ideas above her station." "Mr. Hayes is a better man than you could ever hope to be," Eleanor said quietly. "He builds while you destroy. He nurtures while you take. That's the difference between you, between the world you represent and the one we're creating." Richard's face darkened. "Your little school and workshops won't last. The money will run out, or your resolve will weaken. You're playing at philanthropy because it makes you feel important, but you're still just a servant with delusions of grandeur." Eleanor would have responded, but Lord Pembroke's voice called from inside, announcing the committee's decisions. With a final contemptuous glance, Richard melted back into the shadows as Eleanor returned to the ballroom. Lord Pembroke stood on a small dais, reading from a list. Eleanor held her breath as he worked through smaller donations to various causes. Finally, he cleared his throat. "For our principal beneficiary this year, the committee has selected a new initiative that promises to address a critical need in our community. The Thornfield Recovery House will receive £5,000 for its establishment, with an annual contribution to be determined based on its success." A polite applause followed the announcement, but Eleanor barely heard it. £5,000, enough to renovate the entire wing, equip the rooms, and operate for at least a year. She found Dr. Foster in the crowd, the physician's face alight with triumph. As the formal proceedings concluded and guests began departing, Lady Pembroke approached Eleanor, her expression unreadable. "Congratulations on your project, Miss Reed. It appears you have convinced the committee of its merit." "Thank you," Eleanor replied simply. "The recovery house will benefit many families in the county." Lady Pembroke studied her for a moment. "You know, when you first claimed the Blackwood inheritance, I was certain you would fail spectacularly. A housemaid could not possibly manage an estate of Thornfield's significance. And now? Now I find myself reassessing. Your methods are unconventional, but your results are difficult to dismiss." She lowered her voice. "I saw you speaking with Richard. Be careful. He has not accepted his fall from grace gracefully." Eleanor was surprised by the warning. "Why tell me this?" "Because whatever your background, you are using the Blackwood fortune as Cornelius would have wished, for the betterment of the community. Richard never understood that responsibility." With a slight nod, Lady Pembroke moved away, leaving Eleanor to ponder this unexpected alliance. The carriage ride back to Thornfield gave Eleanor time to process the evening's events. The recovery house would proceed, bringing healing and hope to those who needed it most. Richard's return was troubling, but his threats seemed hollow now that her position was legally secure. And Lady Pembroke's grudging respect suggested that perhaps, in time, even the old guard might come to accept the changes at Thornfield. When the carriage pulled through the gates, Eleanor was surprised to see lights still burning in many windows despite the late hour. Thomas waited at the entrance, his expression tense until he saw her smile. "Good news?" he asked, helping her down. "The best. They've granted the full amount." She embraced him, propriety forgotten in her excitement. But why is everyone still awake? Thomas's face grew serious. There's been a fire in the village. The Miller family's cottage was destroyed. They're here now, Mrs. Miller and the 4 children. Mr. Miller has burns, but Dr. Maxwell is tending to him in the kitchen. Eleanor immediately shed her wrap, all thoughts of the ball forgotten. Are the children all right? Do they have everything they need? Shaken but unharmed. Mrs. Jenkins has prepared rooms in the west wing. Cook made hot chocolate and bread pudding for the little ones. Eleanor squeezed his hand gratefully. You didn't wait for my permission. I knew what you would want done, Thomas replied simply. Together they went to the kitchen, where the Miller family huddled around the large table. Mr. Miller's hands were bandaged, his face streaked with soot. The children, ranging from 3 to 10 years old, looked up with wide, frightened eyes as Eleanor entered. Conscious of her ball gown, which suddenly seemed absurdly grand, Eleanor knelt beside the youngest, a tiny girl clutching a singed cloth doll. Hello, sweetheart. I'm Eleanor. You're safe now. The child regarded her solemnly, then offered her doll for inspection. Daisy got burned. Eleanor examined the doll with appropriate seriousness. Yes, she did. But she's still beautiful and brave, just like you. And I think between us we can make her a new dress tomorrow. Would you like that? The little girl nodded, some of the fear leaving her eyes. Mrs. Miller tried to stand, clearly exhausted but feeling obligated to acknowledge the mistress of the house. Miss Reed, we can't thank you enough. We've lost everything, but at least we're all alive, thank God. Please, sit, Eleanor insisted. You need rest more than I need, thanks. You'll stay at Thornfield as long as necessary. Thomas, could you check if the carpenter's workshop has materials for rebuilding the cottage? Already arranged, he assured her. We'll start as soon as it's light. For the rest of the night, Eleanor moved between practical arrangements and simple comfort, changing from her ball gown into a plain dress, helping settle the children into beds, ensuring Mr. Miller received proper medical attention. By dawn, when the immediate crisis had passed, she found herself back in the kitchen with Thomas, both of them exhausted, but somehow energized by the night's work. You didn't even ask what happened at the ball, she realized, accepting the cup of tea he offered. It seemed less important than making sure a family had shelter. He replied, then smiled. But I'd like to hear now. As she recounted the evening, the committee's decision, Richard's appearance, Lady Pembroke's surprising support, Eleanor was struck by the contrast between the artificial splendor of the ball and the genuine warmth of Thornfield responding to neighbors in need. You know, she said thoughtfully, Richard accused me of playing at philanthropy, of creating schools and workshops to make myself feel important. Thomas frowned. That's absurd. You've poured your heart and soul into Thornfield's transformation. I know, but tonight made me realize something. She gestured toward the rooms where the Miller family slept. This is what Thornfield should be. Not just a school or a recovery house or a workshop, but a true refuge. A place where anyone in need can find help, without judgment or condition. Thomas considered this a sanctuary of sorts, open to all. Exactly. The Blackwood fortune was built on taking from others. Let it be remembered for giving instead. As spring arrived, bringing their wedding day closer, Eleanor and Thomas's vision for Thornfield continued to expand. The recovery house opened with a simple ceremony, the first patients arriving from the hospital to rooms filled with light and overlooking the gardens. The cottage for the Miller family rose from the ashes, built by volunteers from Thomas's workshops and furnished with contributions from throughout the county. Most surprising was the gradual shift in the community's perception. Lady Pembroke, having taken an interest in the recovery house, became an unexpected ally, bringing other influential families into Thornfield's orbit. The whispers about the housemaid and the gardener didn't cease entirely, but they were increasingly drowned out by stories of lives changed through Thornfield's initiatives. 1 week before the wedding, as Eleanor and Thomas walked the grounds reviewing final preparations, a carriage arrived bearing an unexpected visitor. Jonathan Pierce had returned from America, his timing impeccable as always. "I wouldn't miss seeing Margaret's daughter married," he explained as they welcomed him. "Especially not to a man who reminds me so much of your father." Eleanor introduced him to the various projects that had blossomed at Thornfield, the school now teaching 57 children, the workshops training 20 young apprentices, the recovery house already with a waiting list. "You've created something remarkable here," Jonathan observed as they completed their tour, "something that honors both your mother's compassion and your grandfather's vision." "It's still evolving," Eleanor admitted. "Every week brings new challenges, new ideas." "The best endeavors always grow beyond their original design," Jonathan replied. "Like the finest gardens." He glanced meaningfully at Thomas, who smiled at the comparison. On their wedding day, Thornfield was transformed, not with ostentatious decorations or imported flowers, but with simple beauty that reflected the couple's values. The ceremony took place in the gardens, surrounded by blooms Thomas had planted and tended. Eleanor wore a dress of ivory silk, again made by Mrs. Collins, elegant in its simplicity. Thomas stood tall in a new suit, no longer the groundskeeper but a man who had found his purpose alongside the woman he loved. The guests represented every facet of their journey. The entire staff of Thornfield, children from the school and their families, patients well enough to attend from the recovery house, craftsmen from the workshops, even Lady Pembroke, and a select few from county society who had come to respect what Eleanor and Thomas had built together. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of climbing roses, Eleanor felt the presence of those absent, her parents, watching from whatever realm held them now. Cornelius, whose hidden will had set everything in motion, all those who had loved and lost and hoped and endured before them. "I take you, Thomas Hayes," she said clearly, "to be my husband, my partner, and my companion in creating a world more just and generous than the one we inherited." Thomas, never one for many words, replied with simple eloquence, "I take you, Eleanor Reed, to be my wife, knowing that in loving you, I have found my greatest purpose and truest home." As spring melted into summer, Eleanor and Thomas settled into married life, not in the grand master suite that had once housed generations of Blackwoods, but in a comfortable set of rooms overlooking the gardens. Thomas continued to expand. Their days were filled with the work they both loved, creating spaces where healing, learning, and growth could flourish. One evening, as they sat in their private garden after a particularly busy day, Eleanor noticed Thomas watching her with unusual intensity. "What is it?" she asked, setting aside the correspondence she had been reviewing. "I was just thinking about the first time I saw you," he replied. "Your first day at Thornfield, carrying linens up the back stairs. You looked so young and frightened that there was something in your eyes. A determination, a dignity that none of their demands could diminish." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "I was terrified. Everything seemed so grand, so far beyond anything I'd known." "And now?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the manor that had once been her workplace and was now her home. Eleanor considered the question, looking beyond the stone walls to what Thornfield had become. Not a symbol of wealth and privilege, but a center of community and possibility. "Now I understand that buildings are just buildings," she said finally. "It's what happens inside them that matters. The lives changed, the kindness offered, the justice restored." Thomas reached for her hand, his gardener's calluses a reminder of honest work and patient nurturing. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." "And your parents of the man you are," Eleanor replied, thinking of the simple couple who had raised Thomas to value growth over possession, stewardship over ownership. As darkness settled over Thornfield, lights glowed in windows throughout the estate. In the school where adult literacy classes were held in the evenings, in the recovery house where patients found healing, in the cottages where families like the Millers had found new beginnings. Each light representing a life touched by the transformation of a great fortune from an instrument of power into a source of hope. Eleanor Reed Hayes, once a housemaid who dusted portraits of stern-faced strangers, now the architect of a legacy built on compassion rather than conquest. And, beside her, Thomas Hayes, once a gardener who tended plants others would never appreciate, now helping cultivate human potential with the same patient care he gave to his beloved trees. Together they had proven that true inheritance wasn't measured in pounds or properties, but in the courage to create a more just world, one life at a time. And in doing so, they had transformed not just Thornfield, but the very meaning of wealth itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Satisfaction in her expression. This is true partnership. In business, in marriage, in life, seeing beyond surface to potential. Building something meaningful together. As the evening progressed, Elena found a quiet moment with Alexander in a corner of the gallery. The Takahashis seemed pleased with how things turned out, she observed. Alexander smiled, taking her hand. Hiroshi told me our story inspired him to restructure his own company. Apparently, watching my transformation convinced him there are better measures of success than mere expansion. Imagine that, Elena teased. The great Alexander Kane, accidental philosopher. I had an excellent teacher. He kissed her briefly, still mindful of the public setting. Speaking of which, Hiroshi asked if we'd consider consulting with some of his executives. He wants to establish a corporate foundation similar to what we've created. We? Elena raised an eyebrow. Absolutely we. Your perspective is essential to making these initiatives authentic, rather than mere corporate window dressing. Alexander's expression grew more serious. You help me see what matters, Elena. You always have. The simple acknowledgement that their partnership was one of equals, each bringing different but equally valuable perspectives, filled Elena with quiet joy. As the exhibition wound down, they stood before her centerpiece, a large canvas depicting the intersection where her old apartment building stood, the Chinese restaurant below, the bodega across the street, all rendered in vivid color and meticulous detail. Within the urban landscape, dozens of neighborhood residents went about their daily lives, each face distinct, each story honored. It's extraordinary, Alexander said softly. You can feel the life in it. That's what I was trying to capture, Elena replied. Not just buildings and streets, but the community that gives them meaning. His arm slipped around her waist. Like what you helped me find, not just success, but purpose. Not just achievement, but connection. Elena leaned into him, reflecting on their improbable journey. From a fake marriage arranged for business purposes to a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. From separate worlds to a shared vision that honored both their strengths. What had begun as deception had transformed into the most authentic relationship either had ever known. Proof that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the truest destinations, if only we have the courage to recognize what's real when we find it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.